So, as Robert mentioned, I'm going to share a little bit of my journey, which has not been super linear. When I graduated from Penn, when I got my PhD, I thought I had learned a bunch of stuff. And then I went into industry and discovered that I had learned some stuff, but not all the stuff about building applications for real people to use. So I'm going to share a little bit of that with you today. But I think to, start at the beginning, this was me at the beginning. Though there is a mullet in that second picture on the right, though it's a little bit obscured. And I start there because really from a pretty young age, I have always been fascinated with language and math. My mother was a writer and my dad is still an electrical engineer, and I grew up to be an engineer and a writer. And so the roots of NLP actually went pretty deep for me. I went to Penn undergrad. I studied linguistics and math, and then I stayed there for my PhD in natural language processing. And I thought I wanted to be a professor, which may be the case for several of you. That was my plan basically forever. And then 6 months or so before I finished my PhD, I decided I didn't want to do that. And I didn't know what I wanted to do instead. I spent a year writing, running out of money. I had a friend at Microsoft at the time who said, hey, we're hiring NLP folks for this project. We're taking spell checking and grammar checking beyond the Western world. We're bringing it into our developer platform. Maybe you should come work here. And I was like, nope, I don't want to be in technology. I don't like any of those people. I've been coding since I was 4, not into it. And he said, okay, but you said you needed a job. And I said, that is true. I did need a job. And so I went to interview. And in my interview, I thought I was really qualified. They'd been recruiting me. I was super excited. A much more tenured person who was part of my interview asked me this really interesting question, which is, how do you know when a product is good enough to ship? Right? And this was not a linguist. This was not an NLP person. This was an experienced product leader. A very simple question. And the answer I gave was super academic. I had recently come off of finishing my dissertation. I was publishing papers. I was speaking at conferences, and they were all variations on the same theme where I had an area of inquiry, and I just kept working and working at it and sharing as I went. And I said, well, the product's never really done. You just keep working at it, and periodically you fork your work for people to see it and give you feedback and experience it. And he was like, that's the wrong answer. A product is done when people will pay you for it. And in that moment was years worth of education. I did get hired coming out of the loop. I'm convinced to this day that that guy probably said no, but I did get hired. And my first year in industry was spent really learning that without, you're making a product, you're making an application for people to use that they're presumably giving you money for much of the time. It can't just be cool user experience or cool technology or an interesting research product. People are forking over their hard-earned ducats to have what you've made, and it has to be worthwhile. And so just in that moment was my first clue that a bunch of what I thought I had learned might be really different as I head into industry. So when I graduated, my area of focus was at the syntax pragmatics interface. And there were a bunch of things I knew how to do that I was bringing with me as skills into my industry career. Those of you who know the program at Penn know that it's very interdisciplinary, very corpus-based in its approach to linguistics. So I understood how to build text corpora with hypotheses in mind. It's a very empirically driven program, and I understood how to have a hypothesis about language, build a corpus that would test the hypothesis. I understood how to write code to analyze that corpus. And again, because of the program I was in where sociolinguistics is a big deal, I understood how to consider social aspects, social variables. At that time, all the code that I wrote was pretty much in Perl. It was sort of pre-Python, which dates me a little bit. I did a bunch of linguistic fieldwork with native speaker communities. So with several communities, I went into the community and really did on the ground work. And that was all pretty useful for what was coming, but I had never at that point built anything for real people to use. So that was my foundation when I came in. So with that as the framing, I'm going to go back into sort of 3 chapters today. I'm going to talk a little bit about the academia chapter. I'm going to talk about the sort of corporate industry chapter, and then I'll talk a little bit about the Textio chapter, which is the company that I founded 6 years ago as the CEO and one of 2 co-founders. So when I was in academia, always, I saw a couple people on the list knew me today, a couple people in the talk knew me from this era. So sorry if you're in any of these pictures. This was what grad school was like. We did some linguistics and we drank a lot of wine. Maybe that is familiar to a bunch of you. And these were all a bunch of, wild and crazy linguists, some of whom are pretty famous now in academia. So I'll leave it as an exercise to the reader to identify who they might be. If you want any embarrassing pictures, I probably have more. Some things I did when I was in graduate school. So my real area of focus was, as I said, pragmatic syntax, interface. I looked a lot at double object construction. So basically what predicted when you might say, I gave Robert the book versus I gave the book to Robert across a lot of different age groups and languages. That was very much my area of research for the last couple of years that I was in school. I did somewhat unusually for linguistics graduate students because my home was the linguistics department. Although I did a lot in the computer science department, my home was linguistics. I did a lot of coding internships. So that probably should have been my first clue in graduate school that maybe I was interested in an industry path, but I didn't recognize that till later. I did a lot of on the ground work. So the thing that first brought me to Seattle in my last year of my dissertation was the opportunity to do some child language development work. There's a child language development component to my dissertation where I was working with kids who were kindergarten-ish age, preschool age, and watching how they were learning these double object constructions. And then I did a bunch of field work. I worked with expats from Tahiti who spoke Tahitian and Tahitian French and English and did a lot of language contact work, again, in the same area of double object constructions, pragmatics, and syntax. And then I worked with Hmong communities when I was in Philadelphia. And I think this is pretty typical of people who are in interdisciplinary linguistics or NLP and linguistics programs, which is that you end up really at the boundaries of a bunch of different disciplines together. There was a little bit of linguistics, there was a little bit of computer science, there was math and statistics, there was some psychology, there was some sociology, and I really liked that. That appealed to me quite a bit, and I wondered how that would go when I went into industry. So working with native speakers kind of gave me my first exposure to data ethics, although I'm not sure we had the phrase data ethics at that time. So when I worked with native speakers, there were clear boundaries that we put in place. It was always very important to respect the speaker and center the language community that you were doing work with, especially if, I wasn't Tahitian, I wasn't Hmong, I wasn't part of those speech communities. They always knew the broad strokes of what I was working on. So I might say to families, if I was working with their kids, that I was working on child language development. I wouldn't have gone into the technical details that I was looking at ditransitive constructions or pragmatics, but I gave them sort of the broad strokes of what I was working on. They always knew what I was sharing and with whom. So if you've done any linguistic field work, you know that one of the things you often do to get people to speak really unselfconsciously is you ask sort of provocative questions for people to share experiences that they've had in the past. And sometimes the content, which isn't actually the part you're interested in as a researcher, is very sensitive to the person who is sharing. And of course, the more sensitive the content, the more likely they are to speak without worrying about how they sound. And so that's really where you want to get. So they always knew what I was sharing and with whom, always kept their identities confidential. And sort of fundamentally, when I was collecting their data, it was about learning and advancing the state of the knowledge that we had. It wasn't for any sort of self-serving purpose. It was really academic contribution that was behind it. So a little bit of seeds of some data ethics pieces that were there. I got to the end, and although I had this never-ending view that I was starting a research program that would last for my entire life, I did at some point, like everybody, recognize the reality that a good dissertation is a finished dissertation. And I thought it was good enough when I had some findings to publish. I was pretty young as a PhD student. I thought I had some findings to publish after I'd completed a bunch of work, and my dissertation advisor, who was Ellen Prince, told me I was too young to graduate and be taken seriously, and so I should spend another year finding some more stuff. So I did, and after I had done my time on it, I graduated. It didn't have to be perfect. It certainly wasn't a thing anybody was paying for. It was really intended to launch a career's worth of inquiry. That's what it was for. And so if any of you have, and how long grad school's in the rearview mirror for those of you who attended, there might be some themes here that resonate for you. I was definitely ready to be finished when I finished, even though I didn't know what was next. What turned out to be next was Microsoft. I was going to ask people if they had any idea what language that people are seeing on the screen right now. And Robert's not allowed to answer, but if you want to type into the chat, if you have any ideas, Telugu, good guess. People who might have missed his comment in the intro, it's not, but you're in the right region. Sinhalese, wow, that is fast. Great job, everybody. I don't know who heard it in the intro and who knew it. I have literally never given a talk, including when I used this slide at NACL, where anybody got it right. So this is Sinhalese. I was a few weeks into my job at Microsoft, and I don't know how many of you remember the tsunami that really, struck Southeast Asia in the early 2000s. What's happened? It was 2003, 2004. And at the time, Microsoft was working on a project for the next version of Windows, which became the much maligned Windows Vista, to enable the software that we created for many new languages, including several Indic languages. Steve Ballmer, who was the CEO at the time, went to the region, promised a bunch of stuff, and then came back, and we had to build it, even though it hadn't been in plan. So very typical. I try to keep that in mind as a CEO now, CEO behavior. So one problem, we had been planning on providing this support over a period of 2 years. But when the tsunami hit, the Sri Lankan government needed to be able to use computers in their native language for the simple fact that they needed to find or see if they could identify missing people. When you have a sort of natural catastrophe and everything is chaotic, the first thing people want to do is understand, is my family okay? And the government takes a role in helping people figure that out. And one of my first jobs there, for all of these languages that we were going to support, was making sure that the language could sort words in a way that was alphabetical for native speakers of the language. And if that sounds easy, if you're only familiar with sort of Latin script languages or Cyrillic script languages, it's certainly easy in languages that have been encoded alphabetically in Unicode for a while. But one of the pieces of work that we were doing in that 2-year enterprise was working with Unicode Consortium to make sure that the encodings were appropriate for user expectations. I had a teammate who was our liaison to that group. And so I got a note from my manager on a Thursday afternoon that said, hey, we need to accelerate Sinhala. And I did not read Sinhala. I did not speak Sinhala. I found a couple of native speakers in the broader Microsoft community, and I had to figure out beyond the basic characters when they had vowel extensions or diacritics, how they were supposed to show up, because it's not a very useful sorted list if people can't find anything on it. And it was shocking to me, right? So first of all, as I dove in with these native speakers, I discovered there was no acceptable dictionary standard. Nobody agreed. There had, by the way, nothing electronic, obviously, it wasn't encoded. So what I was able to get were several old paper dictionaries, none of which agreed with each other on the sorting standard that was supposed to be part of it. And so I found myself in the extremely uncomfortable position, given my history of working with native speaker communities and holding their knowledge sort of sacrosanct, of having to, over the period of a weekend, make decisions about how people probably thought the language should sort. And it was really uncomfortable from a language policy and data ethics perspective, because I didn't feel empowered or qualified as a member of that speech community to make those decisions. But disaster was happening. We needed to make those decisions so that people could find their loved ones. So right decision, very uncomfortable. Fast forward a year or so later, and this is now on Windows machines. Unicode has encoded it. And the Sri Lankan government declared what I came up with in a weekend in my office, a national dictionary standard. Shocking. I had left academia thinking that if I wrote a good dissertation, maybe 100 people would read it. And all of a sudden, I was having impact on millions of people's lives in a really concrete way. And it was a moment for me that lit up the power of software and technology. And by the way, some of the data ethics risks involved, but it happened the first few weeks of my industry career, and it has been really formative ever since then. Okay. So some things I got to do in my industry career, which was mostly at Microsoft and a little bit at Amazon before I started Textio. Got to build state-of-the-art language detection library. So enabling technology for other language technologies to build on top of. That was really fun. And again, product is something that people can actually use, something that they would pay for. So I learned in doing a lot of this work to throw out some of my preconceived theoretical biases. As I said, got to decide how some of the languages worldwide ought to be sorted. I led the effort to take Microsoft's sort of core proofing capabilities and make them developer facing. So I didn't know anything about API design. I became an expert. I did tons of developer facing work in the space. And then ultimately, I led the integration of Bing search engine into Microsoft Windows. And so long story short, over that decade, I discovered that my friend was right. I love technology. I was very grateful that he persuaded me to consider working in the industry. And what I was discovering along the way was a thirst for impacting the real experiences that people were having in the software that they use day to day, which is still a passion. But there was a bunch of stuff that I had to learn that I didn't know. As I mentioned already, I learned that a product is a thing people pay for. When you're working on a product with the scale of something like Microsoft or Google or Apple, right? These very large companies. I learned that it's not just about the enabling technology. You have to figure out how to make a user experience that can work for a billion people. I certainly had no experience thinking through user experience problems, even in the context of language. I had to learn to be an engineer. I didn't know how to do that. I knew how to be a researcher. I learned about developer and data ecosystems in academia. Your data ecosystem opportunities are so different because you're not working in a for-profit organization. And I learned how to build teams, which is something I hadn't really done. Although I did reflect after the fact that most of my computational linguistics graduate school classes, I ended up taking on the role of PM, which I didn't know was a job at that time. So again, even early, some of the seeds were there into what became my career. Okay, some of you are probably familiar with this super old dialogue. I know at least a couple people on the call worked on the technology underneath this, but this is a dialogue from an old version of Microsoft Office that lets people customize their spelling and grammar experience in the product. This was an education for me. Again, because I had always been on the enabling side. I was building the dictionaries or building the corpora or analyzing the characters to figure out how they should sort. The first time I had exposure to building a product that an end user would see, I had to start thinking through how you would organize language related information for someone who isn't a linguist to consume and use. And that's been pretty formative in Textio. There's also a bunch of stuff I had to unlearn. I had been really accustomed to relying on relationships with native speakers. I valued the one-on-one field work or 1-on-5 field work. When you're serving a billion people, that's not how you work. I really had to let go of perfection as the end goal. Even when I was publishing my dissertation, I knew it wasn't perfect when I published it, but it was as close as I thought I could reasonably get it. And I had to let that go because, again, product is something that people pay for. And probably the biggest thing on top of thinking about user experience that's been very formative in what we do at Textio is I had to let go of all of my theoretical predispositions. If you come out of any major program in NLP or linguistics, there are different schools of thought. Whose theory of syntax are you using to explain data? How much do you stay theoretical versus empirical? How do you use statistics in your work? It's all great. There's lots of reasons to pick frameworks and commit to it. But when you're building real products, all of those frameworks kind of go out the window. And they're only as useful as what they let you make. So if you're making real software and a heuristic is going to make a better user experience than a complicated deep learning model, you should probably use the heuristic because what you're making is a product and a product is a thing that people pay for. And so that was a real education for me as well, because I had come from sort of like a theoretically purist mentality, and making real software disabused me of that in the first couple of years pretty quickly. So that was sort of the whirlwind of that component. And we're about 10 more minutes, and then I'm going to ask people if they have questions. So about 6.5 years ago, I co-founded Textio. If you don't know what Textio does, we make augmented writing software. We invented the category, we invented augmented writing. And really the concept behind what we make is writing software at the vision level that for anything you're writing helps you do better reaching your audience than you could do by yourself if you were guessing. Right. So when I'm talking to a non-linguist, non-NLP audience, a question I often ask to get people to think about the power of this is to try to remember the last time that you wrote an email that was a little bit questionable, right? One where maybe you were afraid to press send, or you were nervous, you thought you might be misunderstood. Certainly, like, I'm a pretty impetuous, bias for action kind of person. I've had tons of moments in my career where I pressed send and then was like, oh crap, like probably shouldn't have sent that. You know, and the more different from you the recipient is, the easier it is to screw it up. And so if you're like most of us in that situation, what you do is you guess, right? You put your best foot forward. You might ask a friend for feedback. Maybe they help you. But a lot of the vision when we started the company is that if we could understand ahead of time how your language patterns were likely to be received by your intended audience, we could help people, a billion people, not just linguists or data scientists, do better than they would do on their own. And so I co-founded the company with Jensen Harris, who's our CTO. He came from a deep user experience background. He invented the first UI for mainstream email, which became Outlook, and then led the Word, PowerPoint, Excel user experience, and led Microsoft Surface user experience. So he had this like deep history of 3 times building user experience products in the productivity space for a billion people. And that led us to start Textio. So one of the sort of ways we often introduce people to what we do, to the concept that there are patterns in language, is we hold up a mirror to them, showing them how they sound already. So the first product that we built and shipped helps people write job descriptions that will fill more quickly, that reach a diverse and qualified audience of people. And one of the things we often do is we say to a new partner, hey, here's how you already sound. We look at what they're saying in public and we hold up that mirror. So if you talk to someone at Amazon and you say, hey, did you know that you're saying the word maniacal in all of your public content? 11 times more frequently than the rest of the industry, that tends to get people's attention pretty quickly. Or, hey, Facebook, ruthlessly 21 times more often than the rest of the industry. What's that about? Is that really who you want to be? And so we often use some of these pieces to introduce potential partners to the power of language and the choices they're making, because of course the choices that they're making have impact on who actually responds to what they say. So in the back end, if you have a data feedback loop that tells you when you've used different patterns of language, who has actually applied to the job, who has actually answered the email, then you can predict for the next document what is likely to happen and help people do a little bit better than they would do on their own. So I'm going to show you just for a minute real quick so you get a little bit of an idea. Whoops, that's not what we wanted to do. Okay. So this is Textio's writing screen. And I, for the sake of demo, jump-started us here with what often people are trying to do if they're, let's say they're hiring a machine learning engineer. Maybe this is a list of requirements, a pretty typical situation for one of our customers to come with. What I'm going to show you here is our Textio Flow engine, which was built by some of the people on this call today. So for the sake of illustrating this to you, I have sort of set my language pattern to follow the patterns of Apple in some homage to Robert, our host today. So we are going to quickly in, a minute and a half, 2 minutes, write a job description that sounds like Apple, will perform really well for Apple, and show you how it works. So what you're going to see here, this blinking caret, you see this tab to flow button up here. I'm going to go ahead and press tab. And when I do, something pretty powerful is going to happen. Textio is going to take a look at the phrase machine learning engineer, and it's going to generate some alternatives that sound like how Apple would describe this work. So if I press tab, we'll see what happens here. You see I have some options here. It's not bad. If I don't like it, I can get to another one. If I don't like it, I can get to another one. And you see some of these colors start to show up. We're going to go ahead and accept this. And when something comes in a big package like this, it's very likely that someone on the Apple team has written this in its entirety, and Textio is trying to calibrate, hey, is this about right? These, you see, get a score starting to show up. So that 34 in the upper right-hand corner tells me that this is likely, if I continue working, to perform at about the 34th percentile of similar documents that my audience is seeing. You can see I get a little insight into the likely demographic split of the candidate pool over there on gender, tone, and age, and some additional guidance. If I were to go ahead and let's say this job is in Cupertino, we might get slightly different highlights. Looks like we don't change too much, because of course the language that is likely to work is highly local, right? The language that's going to work to reach an engineer in Cupertino is different than the language that works to hire an accountant in New York. And if I were to hover over, I get a little bit of information about how this is working. If I want to go ahead and maybe change the mix of who I'm reaching here, I can choose an alternative and do that. And if I were to continue, I'll just do quickly, tabbing on through, I'm going to, yeah, that seems pretty good. We'll accept it. Yeah, that's pretty good. We'll accept it. We'll probably accept most of them since we're working through. It's just a word processor. So if I like this, but I don't like it perfectly, maybe I want to change this a little. I can say expert knowledge. It's not enough just to be a basic here. See, I've introduced a phrase that has a little bit of bias with it, and I could kind of go on through, and we'll take that and we'll maybe take the next one. And you see I'm starting to get a lot of colors here lighting up, telling me what is likely to happen. Here's an opportunity to do a little better than I've done on my own. And really pretty quickly, in just a couple of minutes, we've gotten to a score that is better than where we started. And so you get the idea. We would continue and spend a couple minutes and get up to maybe that 90 out of 100, which is a scoring threshold. So you can see a bunch of stuff here. We can talk about what's underneath it and what's making it happen. But one of the things that is most important to notice about how we build and sort of what I've taken from some of the prior chapters is this is a product that a consumer would pay for. This is a product that you don't need to be a data scientist to figure out how to use. If you understand how to type and hover and press tab, you can use Textio. It was designed, though we don't have a billion users, it was designed so that a billion people could use it. So very important for us is that this is not a product that is just wonky. This is a product that your everyday, in this case, recruiter can use. All right, let me come back out of this and come back here. So underneath these pieces, sort of all of this is predicated on something that we call learning loops. And if you don't know what a learning loop is, you probably are more familiar with them than you think. You're using them every day. So as people are using Textio together, right, as the whole team at Apple is using Textio and getting performance results on the documents that they're writing, Textio was able to build a pretty good model of what works for Apple. And by the way, Apple's just a technology company and it participates in a cohort, and there are some patterns that work broadly across technology. And by the way, Apple does a lot of its tech hiring in the Bay Area, and Apple participates in some of those patterns. And Textio can start building sort of segments around different audience cohorts. This is just like what happens when you use software like Waze or Google Maps to drive somewhere, right? If we're all using the software, then we're all sending our coordinates to the software when we're driving. And if Robert is stuck ahead of me in traffic on the highway because there's an accident, I'm going to get an alert to tell me to get off the highway and exit sooner. That if I were just driving sort of cold with my paper atlas, I wouldn't have that data. I wouldn't get different recommendations. I wouldn't make different decisions. Textio is much the same. If everybody is writing together, contributing their outcomes to the platform, then we all have the opportunity to perform better than we would have on our own. So I think you see these learning loops in consumer software all the time. They are definitely beginning to take over B2B software as well. So there's a lot more I could say. That's a little bit of a whirlwind tour, but I wanted to leave you just before we dump into questions, that when you're building software this way with learning loops underneath it, there are some really important principles of data ethics that I think, at least for me, I've drawn very much from some of that work that I did on much smaller scale earlier in my career. And I think this is super important in the work that we're creating as an industry right now. So I often finish sharing at least my perspective on this. The first piece, which is no surprises, if you're collecting data about how people are using your product to create a learning loop, however virtuous, right? If it's powering a better experience, as in the case of Textio or Waze, it could be super virtuous. You have to make it clear to people that you're collecting data from the very beginning. Not sure how many people here are familiar with Evernote. You probably most of you know the software. A few years ago, they made a small change to their privacy policy, that they were going to start using machine learning to help people better expedite their task management, help them manage their documents in Evernote a little bit better. And their user base exploded with fury. And Evernote wasn't suggesting anything that was actually controversial at all for word processing software at the time. When the ecosystem exploded, there were tons of articles that were like, hey, are you mad at Evernote? Here's this other software you can use. And Textio was on a lot of those lists. And that was fascinating because we, of course, use the data about what people are writing to make a better writing experience. We know if you take this suggestion 100% of the time and you take that one 0% of the time, well, that other one's probably not that good. And we're going to use that in the experience. But we've been very clear with people from the beginning that that's how the product is created. And so I think it can be really tricky if you try to retrofit a product for a learning loop that wasn't built on a transparent data foundation in the first place. The second piece is also probably obvious, but worth stating, which is that you want to use data the way you say you're using it, obviously for the benefit of your users and your customers, but you don't sell it, you don't share it. If you say you're going to use it a certain way and you're making it clear that you're collecting it, that's how you have to use it. Not every company in the industry, I think we probably all think of some examples in the social media space, has abided by this. So I think this is super important as well. And then the third piece, which I think does harken back to some of the fieldwork principles that I mentioned earlier in the talk, is that it's very important that if you're collecting data, you're using it for the benefit of those who've provided it to you. That means using it to make their application experience better in some way they will recognize as very concrete. So with that, we have about 10 minutes left. I know that was a lot pretty quickly, and a lot that is sort of data ethics and journey rather than confusion matrix and precision and recall. But I would be happy to take questions in the chat. So I will stop sharing. And there's our career site. We are hiring. I will mention that. Let's come back to the chat.
All right, thank you so much, Kieran. I bet the job descriptions on the career site are really well written.
They're pretty good.
I imagine that'd be very compelling. I'll just remind I'll just remind everyone now that we are recording. Well, we'll decide afterwards if we are going to post this video online or not. Please ask your questions in the text chat. And if you're not comfortable being recorded, it's fine just to ask the question there. And I'll turn it over to Kieran to field the questions. Although I'll start with one that Dave asked way up in the chat, which was linguistic. What is the difference between the two different kinds of direct object constructions?
All right, I'll try to do just the 60-second version and not the.
I recommended you read your dissertation, but
no,
maybe there's a shorter version.
No one wants to do that. That's pretty old. Someone cited me recently. It was so exciting. A new graduate student who's working on the area wrote to me out of the blue just for wanting input on my dissertation the other day. I was like, that hasn't happened in like 15 years. It was very exciting. So there's a couple of things at a super high level. The thing that ends up placed second in those alternations tends to be the thing that is prosodically heavier. So loosely speaking, has more syllables. We tend to backload things with high prosody, and tends to be the thing that is more recently mentioned in the conversation. So I'm happy to send a pointer out to Robert to a shorter paper than my dissertation that covers that, if people are interested in.
All right. Actually, if you look in the text comments, I gave an example of both constructions for a direct object. And the second one feels really awkward for exactly that prosody reason. I packed way too much into the first object. So even shorter than a paper, which I'll also send out, I have a 2-sentence.
Even better. Even better. Well, there's a ton of really good questions here. So I am going to go to some of the more recent ones and not go into the ones about Sinhalese sorting, because that knowledge is so far in my rear view mirror. So maybe a question that might be here be interesting. Alak, you asked a question on the casual inference of paying customers to sort of good product. Do you want to clarify that out loud and we can talk through that?
I think it was more on the sort of Microsoft mindset, and whether that's still valid in how they think now, whether if somebody's willing to pay for it, that equates to a good product. I think that may no longer be the case with the open source and Microsoft thinking.
Yeah, I mean, I can't comment on how Microsoft sees it today because I haven't worked there in a while, but I will say that I think some of the same principles apply for products that are open source as well. It's true that people don't pay you for open source contributions or open source products in a commercial sense, but they sort of do have an accountability feedback loop with the application creator around their usage of it. And so presumably if you're making something with the intent of it being useful to a community of people, then the way you know that it's useful to them is whether they continue using the product. And so it's true that money doesn't transfer hands in that situation, but I think a lot of the principles that a product is good enough once it's worthwhile for people to keep using really still apply there. Cool. Great question. Alka, you have a question about data ethics and transparency. Would you like to share that? If I pronounced your name correctly.
Yes, you got my name right. I loved your talk. Everything, your journey, your storytelling, you could tell the importance of language and even the way you frame how you talk about things. So I really am excited to meet you on Zoom.
Thank
And
you.
thank you for the organizer. It's my first event, and I'm just super impressed. So keeping it short, I think there were two questions I posted. One was, I appreciate the practical part of data ethics. So I think what you mentioned was people can talk, about the theory, but here are the three things that companies or people can do. I think that's really, really useful. The question I had when I look at these products, and I come from a conversational AI and language poetry background, so we'll chat later. But do you worry when you make suggestions? And obviously, it depends on which context it is. Say for resume or description, that certain language, like expert or certain kind of language become very quickly trite or overused. And how can they be, refreshed? So it's a little different than the data ethics question because that's very long. But this one's more practical that I thought you might.
Yeah, it's a great observation. Language changes over time. And, one of the examples, maybe especially applicable to this crowd, is that if we were having this conversation in approximately this kind of group 10 years ago, we would have been talking about big data, right? And it was a really cool term. By the way, if you used it in job descriptions at that time, the jobs got many more applicants, they would fill much more quickly. And then what happens is that because it's cool, it becomes popular. And when something becomes really popular, it no longer is cool. It loses that, positive differentiating impact. And then when it becomes really popular, it becomes a cliche, and which is what happened with big data, and it starts having a negative impact, creates a negative impression. AI is going through the same curve right now. You kind of see when you look at engagement with the term, and this happens because language is cyclical. The interesting thing about this is someone is always ahead of the curve. It's not always me, sadly, but someone always finds the new way to sound. And when enough people start recognizing that as a pattern, then it turns out that's the pattern that's going to drive higher engagement over time. So you can't really set it and forget it with guidance. It's really hard to keep it current too, because you got to collect enough data. That's not trivial, and depends on your product. But again, go back to that analogy with Waze or Google Maps. Just because exit 42 is usually the best thing for me, and it was my guidance for the last 28 days, it doesn't mean on the 29th day that I actually won't need to be getting off at exit 41 because of the traffic accident in front of me. So you need to really keep that feedback loop fresh. Okay. So we have 2 minutes. There's a lot of really good questions here. I think I'll take Liam's question because that's a very common one that people ask. Liam, do you want to talk about, looks like the gender bias question?
Yeah, hi. Yeah, I thought it was a really interesting demonstration, the way the platform was being used to sort of display metrics on how language might be interpreted on the other end. So for one example, I saw, let's say when you added the word expert in front of the machine learning blurb there, that was determined to be a sort of masculine biased word. I'm just wondering how a given word is determined to be either masculine or feminine in that case.
Yeah, so it's based on who has responded to documents containing that word in that context in the past. So in the case of job descriptions, some companies are, especially now in the current climate around DEI, thoughtful about who they're trying to reach, which means if you've ever applied for a job and you go to a career site, sometimes you have the option of providing your demographic information, your gender, your race, your age, your veteran status, bunch of stuff. And on average, depending on the company, somewhere between 40 and 70% of people do provide that information. And so that's a form of outcome that the learning loop can learn from. So if you've used the word expert in that approximate linguistic context over oodles, we'll just use oodles for now because the number of documents you need depends on the strength of the impact. then Textio will learn that when you use that phrase in that context next time, it is likely to exert some impact on the gender mix of candidates that come through the door. So it's really based on the tags that you apply to the document when people first come in. So with that, I think we're 30 seconds over, but close to on time. I'm so sorry that I didn't get to all of these questions. These are really great, and I wish we could continue for another half an hour.
Yeah, I always love it when there's a presentation with way more questions than we have time for. It speaks to what this was, which was an incredibly fascinating talk. So thank you again, Kieran. I really appreciate coming in and hearing your story. And I apologize for revealing the Sinhalese.
That's all right.
Question in advance. I think this crowd might have got it anyway.
They might have. Yes, it's a good crowd for that kind of question.
Yeah, and yeah, thank you everyone else for attending. Please join us in the next 2 months. So we have Annalisa Gentile from IBM Watson talking about experts in the loop, although she might change that word from expert to something else now that we've learned that it's gendered. And following that, we'll have the Masakane group speaking, and they've had a lot of really interesting work thinking about community engagement and permission and giving back to the community when you're doing data collection, to speak to the third point that Kieran made about ethics. So I'm really excited to continue that conversation as well. So thank you all, and thank you again, Kieran.
Thanks. Have a great day.